Hello, fabulous sixth graders. This is Mrs. Nyquist. We're going to look at Chapter 8, The Civil War, Part 2 today. During the video, I'd like you to follow along with the text, complete your key terms and chapter comprehension as we go over them in the video, and as always, watch for the mystery word of the day. You're going to need your yellow chapter comprehension, your yellow key terms sheet, and your pen or pencil. Remember, you can always pause the video or go back and watch it again if you need to. Your learning target for today: I can describe the conflicting feelings Minnesotans had about slavery. There were a lot of different feelings people in Minnesota had about the topic of slavery. In this section, the key terms we're going to do are abolitionist, secede, union, and confederacy. We're going to do chapter comprehensions number 4, 5, and 6, and then again, that mystery word of the day. Here we go.
The economics of slavery. A circular flow model is used to show the interaction of buyers and sellers in a market economy. This model shows how slavery connected the North to the South. The marketplace connected buyers and sellers even when they came from different regions. For example, a farmer from the South made money from cotton grown on his farm that was used to make clothing. If a factory owner or employee from the North made money from producing clothing, that person was connected economically to cotton produced by slave labor. As a result, even places that outlawed slavery, like Minnesota, benefited from it.
We're going to be on number 4 on your chapter comprehension. The question is, the North and the South were connected economically. Look at the circular flow model of cotton and clothing, then fill in the blanks. Southern plantations received blank in exchange for providing blank to the northern clothing factories. So we're looking at this top part here. The southern plantations, they received money for providing the cotton to the northern clothing factories. So you're going to write in the first blanks there, southern plantations received money in exchange for providing cotton to the northern clothing factories. Then we look at the bottom part. These factories received blank in exchange for selling blank to the people in the South. And so we have the northern clothing factories receiving money for selling that clothing they made for cotton back to the people in the South. There we go. So these factories received money in exchange for selling clothing to the people in the South. And so it's a circle. The plantations provide the cotton. The northern clothing factories use that cotton to make clothing, so money is also being exchanged both ways.
So what? A moral dilemma. Sometimes values in society conflict with each other. In the 1860s and today, 2 important values existed: making money and treating people fairly. A major cause of the Civil War was that these values were in conflict. Some said that it was morally wrong and unfair to enslave another person. Others felt that slavery was an economic necessity and that their way of life would not survive if it went away. People had strong opinions about what should be done about it, and many were willing to die for their beliefs. Can you think of a current event that causes people to debate the choice between making money and treating people fairly? The Winslow House Hotel, shown here in 1860, was a Minnesota business that profited from Southern tourists. They sometimes brought their enslaved servants with them. Those in the state who were against slavery felt it was wrong to own enslaved African Americans, especially in the free state of Minnesota. Southerners were not the only people who supported slavery. Some Northerners believed that the South should be allowed to keep slavery and that enslaved people who had escaped should be returned to their owners. Nearly all Northerners did agree on one thing, however. They didn't want slavery to spread into the West as new states were formed. Many white Southerners did. Decisions about whether slavery would exist in these new Western states were important because they determined which side would have more power in the U.S. government. Of all the questions involving slavery, this one seemed hardest to resolve. Like Northerners in other states, Minnesotans had varying feelings about slavery and what to do about it. In 1860, those feelings were put to the test. In 1860, St. Anthony and Minneapolis were located across the river from one another. When the two towns merged together in 1872, St. Anthony became part of Minneapolis. Freedom for Eliza Winston. The Mississippi River had become a highway between Minnesota and the cotton plantations of the South. Hundreds of steamboats traveled on the river, carrying passengers in comfort and style. Many of these passengers were wealthy Southerners taking what was called the Fashionable Tour, a popular steamboat trip that traveled the Mississippi River. Hotels in St. Anthony and Minneapolis welcomed the Southern visitors because they were good for business. These Southerners sometimes created a problem when they brought their enslaved household workers with them. In the summer of 1860, a well-to-do Mississippi plantation owner named Richard Christmas arrived in St. Anthony. He was accompanied by his wife, Mary, their child, and an enslaved servant named Eliza Winston. Winston's duties were to care for the child and to wait on a sickly Merry Christmas. When Winston reached Minnesota, she knew she was in a free state, but she wasn't sure what that meant.
All right, so we're going to hear the story here of Eliza Winston. So she was a slave who was owned by a couple coming from the South. So they brought her with them to Minnesota. So the question then became, she was a slave, but she was in a free state. So was she free then, or was she still a slave?
Did it mean she could just walk away from her master? If she did, where would she go? How would she live? Would anyone help her? These questions were answered when she met Emily and Ralph Gray, a free African-American couple who lived in St. Anthony. The Grays were friends of Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery. He was an abolitionist who was working to end it. Abolitionists made up a nationwide movement of both African Americans and European Americans who sought freedom for all. The Grays wanted to help Eliza Winston become free. With the help of some white friends, the Grays convinced Judge Charles Vanderburg to consider Winston's case. Vanderburg sent a sheriff to the house where the Christmases were staying with an order to take Winston into custody. That evening, the judge held a hearing. The whole town was excited. Abolitionists were joyful because they believed the state law was being enforced. Others claimed that Winston had been kidnapped. They worried that publicity about the case would drive away rich Southern visitors. Minnesota merchants depended on the money these visitors spent. Vanderburg heard arguments from both sides and quickly gave his ruling. Eliza Winston was no longer enslaved. She was free to go where she pleased. Finding a place to go, however, would not be easy. That night, a mob of people surrounded the Grays' house, where they thought Winston was staying. They demanded that she be returned to the Christmases. Some threw stones through the windows, and others broke into the home. They searched for Winston, but she was not there. The Grays and their friends had sent Winston to a safe location out of town. It's not known exactly where she went during this time, but she did return to the area a few months later to speak to an abolitionist group. It's not clear what happened to her after that. On August 23, 1860, the St. Anthony Evening News featured the story of Eliza Winston's fight for freedom.
Slave excitement in Minneapolis. Hearing before court. Slave discharged. Conflicting stories. Tuesday witnessed a high excitement in Minneapolis. W.D. Babbitt, a Mrs. Gates, white, and a Mrs. Gray, colored, made complaint that Eliza Winston, a slave, was restrained of her liberty by Colonel Christmas of Mississippi. A writ was issued and placed in the hands of Sheriff Strout, who proceeded to the house of Mrs. Thornton on Lake Harriet, where the parties were residing, and brought Eliza for a hearing before Judge Vanderburg. F.R.E. Cornell, Esquire, appeared as counsel for the complainants, and Freeman, Esquire, of Mississippi, for the defense. Colonel Christmas made no attempt at a technical defense, admitting that the woman was free and at liberty to choose whether to remain with him or to go at large. The court consequently ordered her to be discharged from the custody of the sheriff.
Southerners were upset by the outcome, and tourism to the area quickly declined. Local business people such as C.W. McLean, owner of the Winslow House Hotel, were also upset. They had profited from Southern tourists and were angry at the abolitionists for hurting their business. Abolitionists in Minnesota and other northern states were pleased with the result of this case. They hoped for more successes, but they had no idea how quickly the nation would be plunged into civil war.
All right, so let's go to your key terms. We're going to do the first key term of this chapter here. And the first one is abolitionist. Abolitionist. Definition: someone who wants to end slavery. Then we're going to go to number 5 on your chapter comprehension. The question is fill in the boxes telling Eliza Winston's story. So the first one is done for you. The Christmas family arrives in Minnesota with their enslaved woman, Eliza Winston. Okay, next in the story, Eliza wonders if she's free because she's in a free state. Third part of the story, Eliza meets with the Grays. They convince a judge to hear her case. This will be the next column down here, or row down. Judge holds a hearing and says Eliza is free. She's in a free state, and so she is free. Remember that said there in the story that the Christmas family was okay with that. They said that's just fine. She gets to decide. However, many Minnesotans did not agree with the decision. Mobs of people surrounded the house. Winston has to go to a safe location. And as a result of that, tourists from the South rarely come to Minnesota anymore. So they know that there is a chance that they would have to give up their slaves. And so tourism declines in Minnesota, which results in less income for Minnesotans.
Home of the Brave. By the fall of 1860, many Minnesotans were turning their attention to politics. In November, they joined with voters, only white men at that time, in other northern states to elect Abraham Lincoln president of the United States. No southern states had voted for Lincoln. Southerners believed his election marked the beginning of the end. To them, Lincoln's victory signaled the end of the Southern way of life, a way of life that depended on slavery. This was a turning point in the nation's history. As a result of Lincoln's victory, Southern states seceded. They declared themselves separate from the United States and formed their own country, the Confederate States of America. President Lincoln announced that it was not legal for the United States to split in two. The Confederates did not back down. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on U.S. troops stationed at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The North and the South, the Union and the Confederacy, were at war. Both sides immediately began building up armies, with each state expected to provide a share of the soldiers. Minnesota contributed a volunteer regiment of 1,009 men. It was made up of soldiers from St. Anthony, St. Paul, and other nearby towns. The 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the first of many regiments from Minnesota, trained at Fort Snelling.
All right, our final section here, we're going to go back to your key terms. There were quite a few here in that section. So on your key term sheet, we're going to look at the word secede. Secede. And it means to withdraw for an organization or a country. So the southern slave states wanted to secede or withdraw from the Union. Uh-oh, this looks like the mystery word of the day. Here it comes. Mystery word of the day is flag. F-L-A-G. Flag. Okay, our next key term is union. Union is the United States of America, often in reference to the northern states during the Civil War. So it's always the Union is always all of the United States, but usually when you hear the word Union, you're talking about the northern states in the Civil War. And our last term for today is Confederacy. Confederacy are the 11 southern states that seceded or left from the Union during the Civil War. They're also called the Confederate States of America. We're going to go now to your chapter comprehension. Question is number 6. What events led to the Civil War? Finish the following chain reaction. So we've got some arrows here. That means that this thing caused this thing, caused this thing, caused this thing. The first one is President Lincoln is elected in 1860. That led to those 11 southern states seceding. So the southern states secede. That led to the Confederates attacking U.S. Fort Sumter and war. We've got the Civil War starting. And that led to the 1st Minnesota Regiment forming in 1861. So Minnesota sent troops to help fight the war. So those are the steps in the road to the Civil War. So if you have the key terms, abolitionist, secede, Union, and Confederacy, if you have your chapter comprehension numbers 4, 5, and 6, and if you have that mystery word of the day done, then you are done. You need to go back to the Google form, answer the mystery word of the day question, submit that, and you are done for today. Have a great day, everyone.